There's a kind of man this world doesn't make much anymore. A man who rises before the sun, not because an alarm tells him to, but because the land calls him. A man whose hands carry the story of 50 years in their calluses. A man who has buried a wife, raised 3 children, and coaxed life from soil that others said was worthless. His name was Earl Hutchins, and on a cold Tuesday morning in October, a letter arrived at his door that nearly ended everything. Earl Hutchins was 71 years old, and he lived on 340 acres of farmland in the hill country of central Tennessee, about 12 miles outside a town called Grover's Creek. He hadn't always lived alone. For 43 years, his wife Marvella had stood beside him in that farmhouse, cooking, laughing, arguing about whether to rotate the cornfields, pressing wildflowers in old books, singing hymns in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. She passed 6 years ago from a cancer that crept up quietly, the way those things do, and took her before either of them was ready. Their 3 kids had moved on: a daughter in Nashville, a son in Phoenix, another son working on oil rigs in the Gulf. They called on birthdays, they visited at Christmas. They loved Earl in the way people love things they've grown too busy to hold on to, so Earl stayed. He stayed because the land was his in the deepest sense of the word. His grandfather had broken this soil with a mule and a steel plow. His father had expanded it acre by acre through 2 droughts and a flood. And Earl had tended it, protected it, and made it produce when every reasonable person said it was time to sell. The farm ran a modest cattle operation, about 80 head, alongside a rotating crop of soybeans and hay. It wasn't glamorous. Most years it wasn't even particularly profitable, but it was paid for, or so Earl believed. Back in 2009, during the financial crash, Earl had taken out a refinancing loan through Pinnacle Agricultural Lending Group, a bank that had, at the time, positioned itself as a farmer-friendly institution. The loan consolidated some equipment debts, helped him survive 2 bad harvests, and bought him breathing room. He'd been paying it down ever since. What he didn't know, what no one had clearly explained to him, was buried deep in the fine print of that loan agreement. A clause, small, quiet, devastating, a balloon payment provision. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Earl almost didn't open it that morning. He had a fence line down on the north pasture and 2 heifers that had gotten into the neighbor's property overnight. He was already running late, already tired, already thinking about the list of things that needed doing before the first frost hit. But something about the envelope made him stop. The return address was from Pinnacle's corporate office, not the local branch, not his usual loan officer Gary, who'd always been reasonable enough. This was from somewhere called the Asset Management and Recovery Division. He sat down on the porch steps and opened it with his pocket knife, the way he opened everything. The letter was 4 paragraphs long and written in the kind of language designed to confuse more than communicate. But Earl read it 3 times slowly, and by the 3rd time the meaning was clear. The balloon payment on his 2009 loan, $214,000, was due in full within 60 days. 60 days. Earl sat on those steps for a long time. A crow landed on the fence post across the yard and stared at him. He stared back. He'd known, in a vague way, that there was some kind of lump sum component to the original loan. But Gary had assured him back in 2009 that renegotiation would be standard practice when the time came. Gary had used the word routine. Earl had trusted that word. Earl had trusted Gary. Gary no longer worked at Pinnacle. And whoever had replaced him wasn't interested in the word routine. Earl called the number on the letter. He was transferred 3 times before reaching a woman named Christine, who spoke in the measured, apologetic tone of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer felt like news to her. She confirmed the amount. She confirmed the deadline. She informed him that if the balance was not paid or a repayment agreement not reached, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings on the property securing the loan. The property securing the loan was the farm, all 340 acres of it. Earl thanked her. He hung up. He sat back down on the porch and looked out at his grandfather's land, and didn't say a single word for a very long time. Over the next 3 weeks, Earl learned something he'd always suspected but never been forced to confront directly. The system is not built for men like him. He drove to the local branch of Pinnacle and met with a new loan officer, a young man named Derek who wore a tie and called Earl sir in a way that felt like the opposite of respect. Derek explained, with charts and printed documents and a lot of careful language, that the bank had been acquired by a larger financial holding company 2 years prior. The new parent company had conducted a portfolio review. Loans with balloon provisions that had gone untriggered were now being activated as part of a strategy to optimize asset performance. Earl asked what that meant in plain English. Derek told him it meant the bank needed the money, and Earl had 60 days, now 48, to produce it. Earl drove home and called his son in Phoenix, who put him in touch with a financial advisor who, after listening for 20 minutes, told Earl the situation was challenging. He called his daughter in Nashville, who offered to lend him $20,000 and broke down crying when she realized it wasn't close to enough. He called 3 different banks about refinancing the balloon payment. 2 of them rejected him within 48 hours. The third asked for so much collateral documentation that Earl would have needed a full-time assistant just to gather it. He called a lawyer, a general practice attorney in Grover's Creek named Howard Finch, who'd handled Earl's will and a property boundary dispute back in 2014. Howard reviewed the loan documents and confirmed that the balloon clause was, in fact, legally enforceable. He also noted something else, something he flagged quietly with the careful energy of a man who didn't want to get anyone's hopes up. Earl, Howard said, when exactly did they first notify you that this payment was coming? Earl showed him the letter. Howard looked at the date, he looked at the original loan documents, he looked at the date again, and he picked up the phone. What Howard Finch had noticed, tucked inside a clause that Pinnacle's asset management team apparently hadn't thought twice about, was a notification requirement. The original 2009 loan agreement, drafted under Tennessee's agricultural lending statutes, contained a provision that was easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once you saw it. The balloon payment could only be enforced after the borrower received written notice no fewer than 90 days before the due date. The letter Earl had received was dated 60 days out, 30 days short of the legal requirement. Howard Finch called the bank's legal department that same afternoon. He was polite, professional, and very precise. He explained that his client had received inadequate notice under the terms of the original agreement and under applicable Tennessee state law. He explained that any attempt to enforce the foreclosure within the original timeline would be legally contestable. He explained that he was prepared to file for an injunction that same week if the bank did not agree to a renegotiation period. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then, as Howard later described it to Earl, the voice on the other end got much more careful. Pinnacle's legal team requested 3 days to review. Howard said they had 2. Earl sat at his kitchen table during those 2 days and did what he had always done when things were out of his hands. He worked. He mended fences. He fed his cattle. He chopped wood for the coming winter. He prayed quietly in the way old men pray, not demanding, just present. On the morning of the second day, Howard called. Pinnacle was willing to negotiate, not because they were generous, not because they had grown a conscience, but because their own lawyers had looked at the notification clause and realized that Howard Finch, a general practice attorney in a small Tennessee town, had them cornered. A court filing would delay any enforcement action for months, possibly longer. The optics of a large financial holding company foreclosing on a 71-year-old widowed farmer over a paperwork technicality they themselves had created were not, how did the corporate memo put it, aligned with stakeholder values. Earl refinanced the balloon payment at a substantially reduced interest rate, spread over 7 additional years, with a monthly payment he could actually manage. He signed the new agreement on a Thursday. Howard Finch charged him $800 for the whole thing, which Earl paid in cash with a handshake and a jar of sourwood honey. Here is what the bank's asset management and recovery division had assumed when they mailed that letter to Earl Hutchins. They assumed he would be overwhelmed. That the numbers would paralyze him, that the jargon would confuse him, that the deadline would panic him into either scrambling to sell assets at a loss or simply surrendering. They assumed that a 71-year-old farmer in central Tennessee, 12 miles from a small town, dealing with a letter from a corporate legal division, would have no recourse and no fight left. They had miscalculated on every count. Earl wasn't paralyzed because he had survived things far harder than a letter. He wasn't confused because he asked questions until he understood. He didn't panic because panic had never once helped him coax a crop out of bad soil or bring a calf through a cold night. And he wasn't without recourse, because he had something the bank's analysts never thought to factor into their spreadsheets: decades of quiet, stubborn relationship building in a community where people showed up for each other. Howard Finch had taken Earl's case seriously not just because it was professional, but because Earl Hutchins was the kind of man who, when Howard's own father was dying back in 2018, had shown up at the hospital with a cooler of food and sat with the family for 4 hours without being asked. That's not a line item on any asset performance review. Earl's daughter in Nashville drove down the weekend after the papers were signed. She walked the property with her father through the soybean fields, past the cattle pond, up to the old ridge where you could see the whole farm laid out below like something from a painting. She held his hand and didn't say much. Earl didn't say much either. But at one point, looking out across those 340 acres that his grandfather had claimed and his father had grown and he had held, Earl said something she would remember for the rest of her life. They thought they were coming for the land, he said. But they forgot who the land belongs to. There are stories we tell about power, about who has it and who doesn't. About the institutions that seem too large and too complex to fight, and the individuals who stand in front of them with nothing but what they know and what they've earned. Earl Hutchins didn't defeat a bank because he was exceptional. He didn't have a team of lawyers or a cache of capital or a political connection pulling strings. He defeated it, or rather, he survived it, because he did something ordinary people forget they're allowed to do. He read carefully. He asked questions. He found the one person in his community who knew what to look for, and he refused quietly and completely to assume that the outcome had already been decided for him. Banks are powerful, corporations are powerful, legal documents written in small print are powerful, but they are not infallible. They make mistakes, they cut corners, they assume that most people won't look closely enough to see where the structure is weak. Earl looked. That was his final move, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just careful attention and the courage to push back, even when everything felt like it was designed to make him stop pushing. His grandfather broke this land with a mule and a plow. His father held it through drought and flood. Earl held it through a bank that thought a letter could undo what 3 generations had built. The crow is still on that fence post. The cattle still move across the north pasture in the early morning light. The farmhouse is still standing. And Earl Hutchins still rises before the sun, because the land is calling.